I didn't plan to come back like this. For a long time, I thought if I ever saw them again it would be accidental. A grocery store ale, maybe. A glance that lingered too long. Something small enough to walk away from. Instead, it was a court summons. Their names were printed neatly at the top. As if nothing had ever fractured. As if I hadn't stood on the edge of their driveway at 16 with a single bag and nowhere to go. I remember that day less for what was said and more for what wasn't. No one asked where I would sleep. No one asked if I was scared. The door closed with a kind of finality that taught me quickly. Some endings don't need words. For years after, I learned how to exist without being expected. Finished school at night. Worked during the day. Made decisions without advice, which is another way of saying I made a lot of mistakes alone. My grandmother was the only exception. She didn't agree with what happened, but she never turned it into a confrontation. She sent small things, letters, mostly. Occasionally money, though never enough to change anything materially. It wasn't about that, it was about being remembered. When she died, I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't bring myself to stand in a room with people who had erased me so easily. I told myself grief didn't require witnesses. The inheritance came later, quietly. A lawyer's office, a file, a number that didn't feel real at first, 6 million. It didn't feel like winning anything. It felt like something misplaced had finally reached me. I used it carefully. Paid off debts. Bought a small apartment, invested the rest. It didn't change who I was, but it removed a certain kind of fear I'd carried for years. I thought that was the end of it. Then they found out. I don't know how. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that suddenly, after 2 decades of silence, they had something to say to me, though. Not directly. Their lawyer contacted mine. They were contesting the will. Claiming undue influence. Suggesting I had manipulated my grandmother in her later years. It would have been almost laughable if it wasn't so deliberate. We never spoke before the hearing. Everything passed through documents, filings. Arguments constructed by people who had no emotional stake in any of it. Still, I could feel it, something familiar in the way they framed it. The same certainty that they were entitled to decide what I deserved. The day of the hearing, I arrived early. Courtrooms are quieter than people expect. Not silent, but controlled. Every sound feels placed, papers shifting, shoes against polished floors, low conversations that stop when someone official walks in. I sat at the front, reviewing notes I didn't really need. My lawyer spoke occasionally, but mostly left me alone. When they walked in, I recognized them instantly. Time had changed them in predictable ways. Softer lines, slower movements. But the way they carried themselves hadn't shifted. There was still that sense of being right before anything had even been said. They didn't look at me at first. When they did, it was brief. Measured. Then they sat across the room close to their lawyer. I watched them exchange a few quiet words. At one point my mother smiled, small, but unmistakable. It wasn't warmth, it was confidence. I wondered, briefly, what they thought this would be. Closure, correction. A way to rewrite something that had already happened without them. The clerk called the room to order. Everyone stood. There's a moment, right before proceedings begin, where everything feels suspended. Roles settle into place. Voices prepare to become formal. Their lawyer stood first. He adjusted his jacket, glanced at his notes, then toward the bench as I stepped forward. "Good morning, Judge." It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. There was a pause, not dramatic, just long enough for meaning to register. I didn't look at my parent immediately. I took my seat. Adjusted the files in front of me, acknowledged the room in the way I had done hundreds of times before. Procedure first. Always. When I finally allowed myself a glance in their direction, the confidence had shifted in something less defined. Not shock exactly. Not even disbelief. More like a recalculation that had come too late. The hearing moved forward. Arguments were preferenced. Language stayed precise. Detached from the history that had led us there. I listened the way I always do, carefully, without interruption. Not as a daughter. Not as someone with anything to prove. Just as the person responsible for the decision. They didn't address me directly. They couldn't. And I didn't address them as anything other than parties in a case. That was the boundary, clear. Necessary. By the time it ended, there was no moment of release. No visible shift that anyone outside the room would recognize as significant. Just a ruling, grounded in evidence. Final in the way legal decisions are meant to be. When it was over, people gathered their things. Conversations resumed in low tones. The room returned to something ordinary. They left without approaching me. I stayed behind for a moment longer than necessary. Reviewing papers that didn't need reviewing. Not to avoid them. Just to let the quiet settle back into something familiar. I had imagined, once, that seeing them again would feel like reopening something unfinished. It didn't. Whatever needed to end had already ended years ago. This was just where it became official.